My name is Lowdru Hastings Robinson.
Great. And I'd like you to just tell me all the places you've lived in your life.
Wow, that should be easy, but I'll give it a try. I lived in Bermuda first, then Canada, th- then in China, and then the UK. In the UK, I lived in Portishead, which is a suburb of Bristol, and I live on right on the Bristol Channel. It's a marina, and it's a lovely location.
That's where you are now?
That's where I am now.
Wonderful. So, before we start talking about spirituality and faith, I just want to understand more about you and your life. So, can you just tell me about your upbringing and your education?
Uh, I think when I talk about my life, I first must talk about my grandmother, which may seem a bit strange in a way. Normally, I suppose people talk about their mother, but I lived next door to, and my grandmother was the kindest person I've ever met in my entire life. So I always think of her first when I think of my life. That's not to say my mother wasn't a good mother. Um, I grew up in Bermuda, living on Parsons Road, actually not too far from what was known as the island's trash dump.
Mm.
So you could take from that that it was a very poor area. It might have been a very poor area when I think about it now, but when I think about it as a child, it was wonderful. Uh, Although it might have been a poverty thing, I did not have that sense of poverty growing up. I went to Central School, which was a very large school, and I guess at that point, uh, there was something a little bit different about that school in the sense that it had the normal grades, but the headmaster of the school used to pick students and almost make them take extra lessons in the afternoon. And I never understood what that was for until I reached a point where I had to take an examination to get into high school. And what he was doing was choosing students that he thought would make the academic grade to take the test and to get into high school. Now, I took that test, but I can tell you looking back, I would much rather have been outside playing football than staying after school to be prepared for a test. So, from that school, by the way, that was a segregated school because in Bermuda at that time, almost total apartheid. All white children went to white schools, all black and brown children went to the other school. So I took the examination for high school, passed the examination, and I went to a school called the Berkeley Institute. There were only three, I think, high schools for children of color at that time in Bermuda. And I think it was a 5-year program. At the end of it, you took what was called a Cambridge examination, which was an overseas examination from Cambridge University for students living in British colonies. And having passed that, I qualified to go to university, but of course had no money to go to university. And the government at that time offered scholarships to become a teacher. It was a 2-year commitment to be educated in either Canada or the United Kingdom, and then you'd have to go back and teach for 3 years. So I had a scholarship that took me to Ottawa in Canada, finished the 2 years, went back, taught for the 3 years. The contract ended on the final day. It was a half day. The school was closed in the afternoon. That afternoon, I left for Canada, never to return to Bermuda again. I definitely convinced myself I could not live in an apartheid system anymore. The experience of living in Canada with the relative freedom, there were some restrictions, but nothing really that noticeable. But that kind of freedom was just overwhelming. One of the things that really struck me, I lived at the YMCA for the first year, and there was an election, Diefenbaker versus Pearson. And I saw on the pole outside of the YMCA the list of voters. And I just glanced through the list to see what it was like, and I saw my name. Unbelievable. Because in Bermuda, I was not eligible to vote. In Bermuda, you had to own property at a certain value. My father never owned that kind of property. My father never voted. And here I was in a foreign country and eligible to vote in Canada's election. That really is a memory I'll never forget. That's an example of the kind of freedom that one had in Canada. It made it almost impossible to live under apartheid in Bermuda. And after that, I went on to teach in Canada after I returned, and I did university courses. At this point, I was living in Thunder Bay, Ontario. When I lived there, it was Fort William, Ontario. So I went to school and taught classes, and at night and afternoons did university exams and got my first degree there. I learned something in high school from a favorite teacher of mine, a concept called twice as good, which meant that if you were not a white person and you were living and working in a white society, you need to be twice as qualified to make sure you can get a job. So even though I was working as a teacher, I took extra classes. I got a bachelor's degree at Lakehead University. I continued to take classes and went on to get a master's in New York. And eventually, many years later, I was able to take a sabbatical from a job that I had in Bermuda. So I did a diploma in international relations, a postgraduate course in the UK. So those were the levels. And somewhere in between that, I took counseling courses because I was eligible to become the school counselor at a vocational school in Ontario. And of course, once I had retired from working in Bermuda, I went to China where my daughter lived, worked in an international school, and they didn't have a counseling program. So I set up the counseling program and became a counselor in that school as well. So that pretty much is an overview of my formal education.
So tell me about going back to Bermuda, because you said you intended to never go back.
I definitely did not intend to go back, but when I was a counselor in Hamilton, Ontario, at the school I worked at, I had an arrangement with a teacher in Bermuda, Merle Brock Swan was her name, and we made an arrangement for an exchange visit. And the day I arrived with my students, because I went to Bermuda first, she brought me application forms for a new job that the government had just set up. It was a director of community affairs. Take a step backwards. In 1977, Bermuda had its worst riot ever. But because it's a British colony, it was called disturbances. And as a result of that, there was a royal commission with an inquiry, which ended up being called a Pitt Report. And one of the things it recommended was that there should be a Ministry of Community and Cultural Affairs to work on community and race relations. So the government was seeking a director for that department. And of course, because I had a lot of respect for that particular teacher, she gave me the forms, I filled them out. I had no intention of going back there. A few weeks later, I got a phone call inviting me to come for an interview, all expenses paid. So I was able to get time off from school to go and do it. Long story short, I ended up in the job. So
Tell me about that job and what you did in it, and tell me about that time in Bermuda.
Well, like I said at the beginning, I never intended to go back. But once I was offered the job and I realized it was a job trying to develop better community and race relations, I actually thought of my grandfather, who was always talking about improving race relations. And I felt that here was an opportunity to at least try. I had no idea whether I could do it or not, but I had race relations experience working in Canada with certain communities, so I decided to go and give it a shot. But there was a real blessing in a way, because the Pitt report that was done by this commission was an excellent overview of the problems in Bermuda, with some suggestions as to what could be done to help remove some of these problems. I studied sentence by sentence and was able to come up with certain programs that became effective and really got me started.
Like, what did you come up with?
Well, the longest and best program was the idea that one should have respect for heritage, and not just a one-sided heritage, but heritage for all. And out of that came the idea that should be a special anniversary or a festival kind of approach, so that people can learn a bit about each other's heritage without it being a threatening situation. And in Canada, I had worked on programs called It's Your Day, and it was communities of all the ethnic groups in a particular city with a kind of one-day affair, food of their culture, displays of their culture, and that sort of thing. And I decided to try and do something like that. Also, the report had said on the 24th of May every year, there was an annual race of a half marathon. And that was the most integrated event in Bermuda. Black, white, brown people took part in that race. And I got the idea, in thinking back to what we used to do in Canada, was to plan a day where the race would be in the morning. It would end at a large field where people would put on displays of food of their culture and art and other things of their culture, and organizing a parade to go through the main city and end at that particular location. That first parade was in 1979, and I got three people that helped me. One was Portuguese, one was Bermudian, and one was Trinidadian. They were the sort of cultures that existed in Bermuda. And those three men helped me to organize events and participants and floats from those particular groups. And we were able to successfully put on a parade for that day. And Bermuda Day was an outcome of that, because once we decided the 24th of May was the best time for that, because that was the date of the race, I managed to convince the powers that be to change it from Queen Victoria's birthday to Bermuda Day. And it was a very successful event, good press reports. And I'm happy to say this past year, I went to Bermuda to see that Bermuda Day celebration. It's the 44th time it has happened. The only time it stopped was the 2 years for COVID. And ironically, it rained cats and dogs that day, but the parade still went on. And to my amazement, people danced and marched in the streets like it was a sunny day. Because by that time, the spirit of being a Bermudian was well entrenched, and it was a very happy event.
Tell me about when you went back to Bermuda for this community and race relations role. Was apartheid still in place?
Yes, it was.
So,
But laws had been passed to make it not as severe. But it was sort of a quiet kind of segregation at that point. It wasn't extreme. When I grew up, for example, in the theaters, black people sat downstairs, white people upstairs, or black people sat on the sides and white people in the middle. I must tell you a funny thing about this, because when I was a teenager, there was a group of us who used to go to the movies in the segregated theater. But in this one family, two sisters, one was brown and one had white looking skin. And we would go to the theater and they would automatically get tickets. The one who was white would automatically get the ticket for upstairs. The one who was brown would automatically be sold a ticket downstairs. And of course, for us as teenagers, this was the most hilarious thing because here we are in a segregated apartheid system and nobody can tell who's black and who's white. Because in Bermuda, like the United States, one drop rule applied, but you really couldn't tell by looking at people.
So tell me about the journey of apartheid ending in Bermuda. It sounds like you had some role in that.
Well, not really, because it ended with the riot that I spoke about in 1977. I wasn't living there at the time, but there was an incident where the governor of Bermuda was actually murdered, and two people who were caught, they were black people, and there was a trial, and they were found guilty, and they were sentenced to be hung. And during the period of waiting for the hanging, they were secretly hung. And as a result of that, when the general population got a hold of it, that's when the disturbances took place. And at the end of the disturbances, the Royal Commission, and then that led to the job. So I didn't have a role in that at all.
Tell me about, so how many years were you in Bermuda from the time you came back for that community
I
role?
came back in 78, and I left in the year 2000, I think.
Wow.
Yeah.
Were you in the community role that whole time?
Yes. I was first the director of community and cultural affairs, and then they started a new ministry of human affairs, and then I was the director of that one as well.
Tell me about your role as director of human affairs.
In human affairs, one of the things I was able to get the government interested in it was there was a Race Relations Act in place. Ironically, it had all the rules for race relations in terms of better treatment, but it had a commission with no staff. And so it was totally ineffective. So I was able to convince the government to change to a human rights act based on what I had grown up with in Ontario. And I also happened to have been very friendly with Dr. Dan Hill, who was the chairman of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and was able to have him come to Bermuda and help convince the government that human rights was a better concept than just race relations, because then you could deal with things like sex discrimination, age discrimination, physical and emotional discrimination, that sort of thing. So it was a very comprehensive act. And the human rights rule was under this new human affairs ministry.
And tell me more about this Human Rights Act and how you were able to get it to come forward.
The Human Rights Act, the most difficult part was getting the legislation. But again, it was entirely based on the Ontario Human Rights Act, which Dr. Dan Hill was involved in. And it simply had to be adjusted a little bit to conditions of Bermuda. But the basic human rights concept came directly from that. And it set up a commission, but this time the commission had a staff. And the big difference was the staff could actually get involved in any kinds of discrimination, with the basic concept of trying to settle problems as opposed to any kind of legal or financial redress.
When did it get passed?
It actually passed in 1981, and it's still in effect today.
That must make you feel great.
That was a real satisfying experience to see that come into place.
What kind of changes did you see in Bermuda after that?
Obvious changes in terms of job opportunities were a little more even. school desegregation was very effective. Um, a sense of rights of everybody kind of changed. Particularly black people felt more confident in competing and participating in society. But you don't change people's behavior by passing legislation. So segregation continued in other ways. People would not get certain jobs because they were not qualified or whatever. But I must say, at this stage, in 2023, it's pretty effective, the human rights legislation. And if there was segregation there, it would be very subtle and not obvious at all. So it's a much more equal society. When I went to Bermuda, there were two political parties. One party was basically all white, and the other party was basically all black. Today in Bermuda, the premier is black. His party has both black and white people in. The opposition now is both black and white. So it's changed dramatically in the government.
How did you come to decide to leave Bermuda then?
Age was one thing. I reached the retirement age, and I think burnout is probably the other thing. I felt I had done as much as I could, and China was calling me. My daughter was working in China, and I had visited her a few times. And the schools in China were looking for people who could teach English to Chinese students. So I left the job in Bermuda and went and taught in an international school in China.
And have you lived in Bermuda since then?
No, but I've visited a few times. And I don't think I will live there again. I now live in Portishead, it's outside of Bristol. And in my retirement, I live on a marina. It's comfortable. The weather is milder than Canada. I have good friends there. It's a very relaxing place. And in my retirement, I write blogs, so this is a perfect place for that.
So tell me about your spiritual upbringing.
I guess I went to church a lot because I had to go with my grandmother at night. In Bermuda, when I was a boy, we didn't have street lights. And my grandmother used to go to church at least once a week at night. And my task was to hold a flashlight to make sure she could get to the church safely. Because in Bermuda, for some strange reason, we have toads. Most people call them frogs. And almost everybody's afraid of them. They're totally harmless. But they come out on the roads and nobody wants to step on one. So my job was to take my grandmother to church on certain nights of the week. And if I were to start to sort of doze off, she would always give me a pinch. So I ended up listening to the sermons a lot. Not that it meant that much to me as a child, but I certainly went to church a lot of times. And of course, I went to Sunday school. And in Bermuda, of course, the churches were segregated. So all of the churches that I went to, like the AME Church, African Methodist Church, there was a Pentecostal church that was quite popular. I went there. These were all black places. The Seventh-day Adventists had churches. And occasionally I would go to some of their crusade meetings. And when I was a teenager, I can't remember which group it was, but there was a crusade that was playing a series of Sunday nights in a movie theater. And I went to almost all of those. And that was the first conscious feeling that maybe I should become a Christian, because the sort of message they were trying to save you, and it hit me, that I was a sinner and maybe I needed to get saved and that sort of thing. So that was the first time I really consciously thought of religion. All the other experiences of going to Sunday school and churches, it just went right over my head. I didn't take, I, I guess I shouldn't say I didn't take it seriously. It just didn't seem to have much meaning for me. But this particular crusade became kind of personal, and I started to think that, maybe there is something more than the ordinary life that we live day to day. So that was my first conscious thought of religion.
What happened after that? After that, take yourself back to that moment. You're at the crusade. You had this sense that it might be pertinent to you.
Actually, towards the end, it might have been one of the two last sessions that I attended. And after the service, this was on a Sunday night, and there were 3 or 4 of my friends. You dressed like you were going to church. And this particular night after the service, we were passing by a restaurant, and we decided to go in for a Coke. So we all went in, we sat down, we were all nicely dressed. That's why we went into this particular restaurant. We were all so well dressed. They refused to serve us and made us leave. And I had just come from a religious experience saying everybody's God's child and the rest of it. And here they were, because we were the wrong color, and they literally said, we don't serve, in here. And the experience I had had on the previous Sundays, feeling very religious, turned me off totally. And from that point on, I had a concept of God, but it didn't mean anything to me, because I couldn't understand if there was a God. I'm a person, white people are persons. Why are they treating me like this if we're all going to end up going to heaven? And then I also sort of got into the concept of angels are white and God is white. And nobody white meant anything to me. So it turned me off totally. Then I used to go to a barber shop regularly. And my barber would always talk to me in terms of human relations, people being human. It doesn't matter if you're black or white, that, race relations is not the way it should be. And there will come a time when people will be treating each other equally. I thought this guy was insane. This is a segregated place, and you're talking like, there's an opportunity to be equal and the rest of it. So I said to him, where are you getting these strange ideas from? He said, well, I'll give you a couple of books, and you can check for yourself. It turned out they were Baha'i books, and he was a Baha'i. When I read some of the writings in the Baha'i books, I suddenly got a totally different feeling, because I felt that not only was I human, and I should accept somebody who's white, they are also human, and they should accept someone who is black. And instead of hating white people per se, I started feeling sorry for them, because they didn't know that we were both equal in terms of our humanity, and therefore should be treating each other better. And after reading a number of the books that he gave me, I actually became a Baha'i and joined the group that was trying to promote better race relations. And that's when I first got totally interested in the concept of race, and started to look in terms of history of what was going on. And by this point, I was, I guess, about 21, 20, just a little older than that. And I came across the book, Mary Prince, it was called. Mary Prince had been enslaved in Bermuda. She was born in Brackish Pond, Devonshire. I grew up about 15 minutes walk from where she was born. I had gone through the entire education system in Bermuda. I never knew until I was an adult there was slavery in Bermuda. There was nothing in the school curriculum about that. And I didn't know the role Mary Prince played in the abolition movement, because at one point she was taken to England by her master, and she discovered that slaves, the English air is too good for a slave to breathe. I think I quote something along those lines. And she met some of the abolitionist movement people, and she escaped her master. And then she became one of the chief people in the abolition movement, because she would go to the lectures, and at some point in the lecture, she would tell the audience what her life had been like as a slave. And through the abolition movement, she gave her whole story to the group, and they wrote this book, Mary Prince, and so on. Now, I was a full adult when I discovered that, and she was 15 minutes from where I grew up. Skip now to today. There's a Mary Prince Day in Bermuda. Just happened in the last 5 to 10 years. There's a statue dedicated to her, and now she's recognized in Bermuda. But internally, it took me quite a while to get over the shock that I had grown up. I knew there was segregation, and I obviously had a sense of inferiority from that kind of experience. But it was a shock to realize I had gone through that entire experience and didn't know the history. And that's when I started to say, let's find out what really went on. And from that point on, I started to research history, and discovered, for example, in the case of Bermuda, in 1619, the first enslaved people were in Virginia. 3 years later, the second place was Bermuda. And that was a revelation. To think that I had grown up and reached an adulthood and didn't know that. So I further investigated history and have been looking at the concept of race, discovering that race is just an idea. It's not a reality. And the shock of that, having had that kind of experience, and the more I looked into it, the more I discovered how false the concept was and how it was used as a political tool. Because what was happening in the United States when the height of slavery, they were bringing indentured servants over from the UK. And the indentured servants at one point were more than the slaves, but they were all treated the same way. They lived together, they had the same bad treatment. In fact, when you look at the letters they wrote home saying, you might as well call us slaves. So the indentured servants and the Africans they got married, they had children, and of course, when they realized their condition, they started to rebel. And when they started rebelling and fighting back, there was one particular time, I think it's called Bacon's Rebellion. I can't remember the exact date, but it was a disastrous one. And the white masters at that time decided we need to do something to break up that relationship between the indentured white servants and the Africans. And that's when they decided to change conditions to make anyone who had white-looking skin white and special, and anyone who was not white excluded. So they started to draft laws that a white person couldn't marry a black person and so on. And also they started to treat the indentured servants much better. So it was the concept of divide and conquer. Get the white servants to associate with the white masters. And to do that, they legally actually came up with the concept of race. 1671 was the first time I think race was ever written in law. And it developed the concept of white. And of course, a few years later, Blumenbach came up with the idea of trying to classify people by what they call race. And he had a series of skulls that he used to measure. And the skulls that came from people they considered white were classified higher than the ones that were not. Of course, today that's debunked as totally unscientific. But to his credit, you have to give him credit for this. He was talking about the beauty of the skulls as opposed to the skin color. And he never really said one group was superior to the other, but he did rank them. And he ranked them horizontally. But the politicians took the same thing and turned it upside down and ranked it vertically. And the Africans end up on the bottom. And it's from that point the concept of race really took off. Then the religious leaders picked up the idea and defended it. Some of the philosophers wrote quotations that also defended and sort of put whites in the superior position and so forth. So in looking at that history and seeing something that was a little more towards the truth and reality of what's going on, it suddenly, and I'm sure I'm not the first person to see it this way, but the history that's taught to people in schools is the cause of negative race relations that we experience today. They either don't teach you the history correctly or they leave it out. Because if you go back to, say, ancient history, the Greeks, Romans, Africans, and so on, there were no black people in Africa at that time. There were no white people in Europe at that time. In Europe, they were French, they were Italian, they were German, they were English. In Africa, they were Zulu, they were Tutsi, they were all of the various groups. Nobody called themselves white and nobody called themselves black. But once the concept started to be written in law, and once they had the ranking of skulls, that was the real beginning and acceptance of race as a scientific concept. That was what was taught to people in schools, not the real history. Because the ancient Greeks thought the Africans were the wisest and most brilliant people. Greek scholars went to Africa, to the mystery schools, and brought back one good example is Pythagoras, 22 years in Egypt, comes back with the idea of the square on the hypotenuse equal to some of the squares on the outside. In Egypt, the pyramid, the Giza pyramid, is a perfect example of that theorem. Years later, when it's being taught in the schools, it's called the Pythagoras theorem. He learned it in Egypt. It was named years later. And of course, today, everybody thinks that Pythagoras, who is ancient Greek and white, developed that. And that sort of thing happened a lot in history. Things that were done by people of African descent, they are either not mentioned at all, or if they are mentioned by name, you would never have an idea that, and they were of African descent. And that's when I started to write blogs about things like that, because as I learned them, I discovered by talking to other people, they had no idea. All kinds of things. The first person at the North Pole, Peary, I think, is the one who gets the credit. He wasn't the first person. Hanson, who was a black man who worked with him, the two of them were the last two to go, and Peary couldn't make it. Hanson went on and was the first person to get there. But you never know that by reading history. Things like that. That's how race as a negative concept continues to be used because people are learning something that is false right from the beginning.
Tell me about, let's go back to you becoming Baha'i.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like? Take me back to when you first became Baha'i after you got these books from the barber.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about those early days of absorbing Baha'i teachings.
The first thing that really struck me by this was when I met the Baha'is. They were black and white people. I was shocked, treating each other equally. That was better than anything I'd even read, the actual way they treated each other. Some of the ones who were white their families almost disowned them because of the kind of relationships they were having. They were having a difficult time, but they obviously accepted this concept and was prepared to work towards better relationships. So that was a real turning around for me. And the more I met other Baha'is internationally, it totally changed my attitude to the point where today, when I hear of a white person doing something based on their misunderstanding or lack of knowledge, instead of hating them, I feel sorry for them because they don't know. It's almost like when I first found out that things that were happening in Bermuda, which led to segregation and subjected me to that kind of feeling. The kind of relief I got from that, but compared to what I felt like when I didn't know it, white people were in this position if they didn't know the truth. So I actually kind of feel sorry for them and can't blame them. That's all you've ever learned. And that's all you see around you. That's reality. But people are people.
What is your concept of God today?
My God, and this is totally the way I see it. I don't have a concrete concept of God, but I liken God to nature. That nature is not completely understood, but you can feel it and you can see it in the seasons and the changes in climate and all the rest of it. And I see God as something like that. You benefit from the experience of it, but you don't really comprehend it. And also, if you could comprehend it, it wouldn't be the right thing because you have limited knowledge as a person. And when you comprehend or understand something, you often make it in the image you want it to be. And you listen to the teachings of very wise persons who started religion. They always talk of God not as something man-made, but like a concept or an idea or something that's real, but not totally understandable. So I don't have a concrete concept of God. If I look at Michelangelo's paintings, I don't see that as God because I know that was one of his relatives that he used as a model for that. But and so I do have a sense that there's a power greater than me. I don't understand what it is.
Do
But
you feel like you've ever had to rely upon that power or chosen to rely upon that power?
I do in the sense that I like the idea of PMA, positive mental attitude, that power is available to you if you can not only imagine it, but live it and believe in it and keep, as long as it's positive, in terms you're not hurting someone or destroying yourself, that is a source to me of uh, working towards this knowledge of God, the power that gives life and the power that you can share in and become a part of, either positive or negative. And the choice is yours. That's the way I see it. The choice, I should say, is mine. I could work towards positive things or work towards negative things. I have the ability to do both. But in doing the positive, I'm being good to someone else and I'm being good to myself, because when I help somebody else, I feel better.
Tell me about a critical time in your life where you feel like you acted with that power, that you took on that stance, took on that power, and it made a difference for you.
It's when I went back to Bermuda to work in the Ministry of Community Affairs. I still, when I took on the job, or even though I was going to work towards helping race relations, I still had this concept of black, white. And once I got to the stage of more positive thinking, I think that was the kind of power that my relationship of what I determined as God being positive, that helped me to do the kind of work that I was doing. Because even though I was ending up with various projects and so on that worked out, there was a lot of negative things. I talked about the parade and how it's been going for 44 years. Well, in the planning of it, I had committees coming to me saying, don't put this in it and don't do that, leave the gum bays out, and various sort of negative things. But through all of that, because I had this concept that it's a positive thing to improve race relations with everyone, I was able to work in spite of the kinds of things that were trying to stop the work being done.
Tell me about a time of difficulty where you doubted your faith in that.
I don't actually think I ever doubted, because maybe right at the beginning, because even before I got started, I realized in the planning stage that it was a difficult concept. I went back to do the job. I arrived in Bermuda, and I discovered there was no office, there was no staff, there was no place. And the attitude was, we'll have everything ready in about a month, so you just relax uh, and do what you have to do. And when we've got everything together, we will start. And that was the point at which I thought I couldn't do it. Because what that said to me was, these people are not serious. They just want the structure to be there, to say they've put this in place. They're not really interested in anything that's going to move the kind of conditions that exist. And that's when I took that pit report and studied it page by page, line by line, and saw the positive programs that were in there. So I used that to develop it. In that month that I was supposed to be sitting on the beach waiting for them to get me started, I got a friend who was also in government, who was going to be away for all that month. And he gave me his office, and every day I went to his office and worked on plans. So when they found a building and got me some staff, I had a whole plan ready to go. But before that, I was almost ready to quit. I actually seriously thought of quitting. But I knew that it was going to be difficult to go back to Canada to be a teacher, because in Canada, in the teaching profession, you have to be paid at the level of your qualifications. And by this time in Canada, I was already at the top of the grade level. So even if a school took me as an ordinary classroom teacher, they would have to pay me at that grade level. So it would not be easy getting a job unless it was a particular job. In fact, I was told that by the director of education before I left, to be aware of that if you decide to return to teaching in Canada. So
Tell me about raising a Baha'i family. Did you raise your daughter Baha'i?
it's interesting because my wife was very prominent and involved in the African Methodist Church. She was part of a trio. She was a singer. So she was very much involved. And she was totally against this idea of me becoming a Baha'i. And it wasn't so much, I guess it was a real confrontation. I still would go to church with her whenever she was performing or whatever. But she was really concerned that my soul was lost, I'm damned, and all the rest of it. So it was a problem for quite a while. And one day, out of the blue, she said to me, I'd like to go to one of those Baha'i meetings that you go to. I was stunned. You really want to go? She said, yes. You know those books you've been reading? And yeah, I started to read them. And I want to know more about this. My wife became a Baha'i from reading the books that I had at home. And she became a Baha'i after that. I never tried to teach her anything because I knew she was so involved with the church. Her reaction initially was very much against it. So when our daughter was born, we were in Northern Ontario at the time, small Baha'i community. So the community taught my daughter as much as we did. Yeah.
Pretty amazing then that your daughter chose to go to China as a Baha'i. And
She did. She was a pioneer in China. And at the time she went to China, even though I was a Baha'i, at that period, China politically was, for the rest of the world, leave that alone because communism and all the rest of it. And I never objected to her going because she was married and had one child at the time. No, three children at the time. And she went off to China, and I couldn't believe it. I've lost my daughter to the communists. So as soon as she got settled, I went to visit. What a revelation again. The people she introduced me to, ordinary Chinese people, very welcoming in their homes, they serve you food. Relationships were far better than I ever had in Bermuda growing up as a child. So she was working in a school, and somebody got sick, and my daughter wrote to me and told me about it. The person's going to be off for like a few months. Would you be interested in coming to fill in? So I went and taught in the school for a little while, and it was a K to end of high school, but they didn't have a counseling department. So I managed to convince them they needed that, and I was already a qualified counselor. So I set up the program and actually worked in that school for, I guess, a few years, and then went on to work at Wellington International. It's actually in the UK. It's called Wellington College, but it's really a high school. So I worked there for a while. And then I stopped working in schools and worked for a private company, working with business people, like managers of major international companies, have Chinese staff, but managers in training could write English, speak it a bit, but not comfortable with it. So I worked with some of the major international companies, Novo Nordisk, large oil company, Conasef, I think it was called. Worked in hospitals, nurses, doctors. It really was a very fulfilling experience because all the people I worked with could read and write English, but were not comfortable speaking it. And for me, that was a real joy of helping people to, be more comfortable in the language.
How did your Baha'i faith develop while you were in China?
That strengthened the concept of the oneness of humanity because Chinese were a distinct group of people. And certainly my total experience with them was like they were like any other people anywhere else I had lived. The same kinds of, not so much that they are different, it's how you relate to them, that you see that they are individuals and also human. So I think that broadened the concept of the international concept of the oneness of humanity. Because prior to going to China, most of the people that I had experience with were either black people or white people. But in China and then going to other countries like Thailand and Malaysia was a real exposure to all kinds of people. And really, for me, you can see the common humanity. The same kinds of good things or bad things had nothing to do with what people look like. Cultures are different, but once you understand the culture, it has much more meaning when you know why they do certain things certain ways.
When you think about your life right now and where you are in your life, what are you most grateful for?
I am most grateful I'm 87. I've lived to experience not only seeing my daughter grow up and have the same concept that I have of the oneness of humanity and so on, but I've seen her children grow up and I've seen them develop in that way. And in fact, I was a counselor in a school. My daughter became a counselor in school. My grandson, Kyle, is a counselor. My granddaughter, Taya, is a counselor for women, particularly in terms of violence against women and helping not only the women to understand it, but helping the men they deal with to understand it. In fact, one of the workshops she did was for a football team in Canada, the Hamilton Tiger Cats. She did workshops on violence against women for them. And in one of their football games that broadcast right across the whole country, she was chosen as a Hamilton hero and was featured on the broadcast during the halftime show. They interviewed her, and the football players talked about workshops and the success they had with them understanding violence against women. So that was really quite something. And to see now my great-grandchildren growing up, that is really a great reward for me. To see all of that and relationship, not just the physical persons, but to see the same kinds of ideas of equality, oneness, and respect for each other being accepted throughout the whole family. That's a great reward for me.
What's your greatest wish?
On the surface, I would say to make it to 90. I guess that's probably a bit of a joke and also a reality in the sense I do want to make it to 90. But that's a hard question to answer. I suppose in more concrete terms, the one thing that I would like to see happen, and it's not going to happen within my lifetime, I would like to see history taught in school, not from the point of the winner or the victors, but from the point of truth, telling the whole story of events that happened. A perfect example, when I was teaching in Hamilton, Ontario, in the Canadian system, in the high schools, they talk a lot about the British, which were Canadians today, the War of 1812. If you pick up a Canadian textbook, they won the War of 1812. You pick up an American textbook, they won the War of 1812. The problem with that is the people in both countries are not getting the truth. And that kind of conflict just continues on. History has to be taught as far as possible with a truth basis. Because in reality, through segregated times, what white children learned in school and what black children didn't learn in school or did, totally different. And yet they're in the same country, and it's the same history. And I don't think that you can move towards a world of more equality and fairness unless people know what happened in the past, good and the bad, and the real, and can make not so much their own decisions, but understand how we got to where we are today. The past is the cause of the present. The present is going to be the cause of the future. Unless you know the real past, the present is always going to be a problem.
Do you have a message?
A message for whom?
Anyone who might see this video?
I guess the message, I don't really have a message directly in the sense that I'm going to say you must do this. But that's the reason I write blogs. I write blogs on human relations so that people can read them. And it's not that I know all the truth, because whatever I'm writing about, it's not just quotes from me, it's from what I've gathered from information. And it's a more balanced way of looking at things in history. And that kind of message, for example, I wrote them, and maybe I've written about 45 altogether. And around about 20, somebody told me they saw it on Google. I didn't even know it was on Google. Every one that I've written is now on Google, total of 45 or so. And I get emails from people all around the world. I get emails from professors at universities, and all encouraging me to do that. And that's the kind of message that really needs to get out. That's what gives me comfort. I'm trying to do that. And other people are also doing that. Unless people really understand what has happened in the past, and unless they understand that race is just an idea, you're never going to have race relations of any, or human relations replacing race relations. My personal thought is, and this is a bit negative in a sense, I don't think you're going to really see equality in human relations until enough generations have died out. It's sad, but some things that you learn as a very young person never gets out of your head. So until this kind of message is taught in schools and people understand complete history as opposed to who won and who lost, that's going to take generations. And things, for example, two things have happened recently that's suddenly forced people to realize the world is one country. COVID and climate. Suddenly you realize what happens in one place can impact the entire world. That's a major step towards moving towards a sense of equality. The world as we see it now is countries, there are lines on maps. When they go in outer space and look back, there are no lines. It's one country. We are insular in the sense that when we live in a country today, we think in terms of that nation as opposed to the whole world. But circumstances and the way things are developing like COVID, climate change, lack of food in places, is moving the whole world towards a recognition that we are all brothers keepers.
When I show people your portrait, what do you want them to know about you?
That I did my best, I tried. And when I say that, I tried to get an understanding that the world is a single country, we all people living in it. And that sense of humanity makes us all interdependent. And that's what I was trying to do in my life and in my life's work. And I don't necessarily want them to believe that or whatever, but I don't want them to look at it and question it and think for themselves.
Lowdru, thank you so much. It's a big honor to interview you tonight.
Thank you.
Anything else you'd like to share?
No, other than to say it was a good experience to get this out and get the message across of how I thought, because as I'm telling you, I'm reinforcing it even in my own thinking. And it's making me look back at, some of the things I was involved in.
Mm.
And it also makes me even comfortable with it, even though I know my contribution is just a minor part, but I tried. And it's better than not having tried.